There are things that happen fast in this world. Lightning, a gunshot, the moment a man realizes he has made the last mistake of his life. And then there are things that happen slow. Justice, truth, the particular kind of reckoning that follows a man who thought he was invisible right up until the moment he wasn't anymore. Texas, summer of 1878. A stagecoach was running a line between San Antonio and a small town called Mineral Wells, carrying 6 passengers, a driver, and a strongbox that was nobody's business but the Wells Fargo Company's. The road was long and the heat was merciless, and the dust came up through the floorboards and settled on everything, and everyone inside, like the land itself, was making a claim. It was a kind of afternoon where sensible people stayed inside and dogs slept under porches, and even the wind seemed too tired to bother. Nobody expected anything to happen on a road like that on an afternoon like that. That was the first mistake. The second mistake belonged to 5 men waiting in the rocks above the canyon road. And the third mistake, the one that would cost him everything, was not looking carefully enough at the quiet man sitting in the corner seat of the stagecoach. The one with the worn coat and the gray eyes and the hands that never moved his gun even once during the entire first hour of the ride. The one nobody had looked at twice. The one who had been counting everything since the moment he got on. His name was Jesse Callum. And in 4 territories, that name meant something specific. Something that the 5 men in the rocks would have recognized immediately if they had known it. They didn't know it. By the time they learned it, the knowing wouldn't help them anymore. The San Antonio to Mineral Wells line ran twice a week through country that had not entirely decided whether it belonged to civilization or to something older and harder. Red hills on both sides of the road for the first 40 miles, then flat scrubland that stretched the horizon in every direction like the earth had given up trying to be interesting. The stagecoach was a Concorde, built heavy and painted a dark red that the dust had turned to a kind of rust color over the years. The driver was a man named Heck Dunbar, 53 years old, who had been driving this line for 11 years and had been held up twice and survived both times by the simple method of doing exactly what he was told and keeping his hands visible. Heck had a philosophy about stagecoach robberies. The strong box was not his money. The horses were not his horses. His life, however, was his life, and he intended to keep it. Inside the coach, 6 passengers had arranged themselves in a particular way that strangers arrange themselves in small enclosed spaces, each person trying to take up exactly their allotted share of the world and no more. By the window on the left side sat a merchant from San Antonio named Gerald Fitch, heavy-set and sweating through his collar, who was traveling to Mineral Wells to collect a debt, and was already irritated about the heat before the ride even began. Beside him sat a young minister named Brother Thomas, fresh from a seminary in the East, whose face had the open, hopeful expression of a man who had not yet had enough of the world explain itself to him. Across from them, taking the right window seat, was a woman named Ada Sinclair. Ada Sinclair was 28 years old, and she was the kind of beautiful that makes a room rearrange itself without anyone deciding to do it. Not soft beautiful, certain beautiful. The kind that comes from a person who has decided exactly who they are and stopped apologizing for it. She had dark hair and direct eyes, and she wore a traveling dress the color of deep water, and she held a small leather bag on her lap with both hands, and she looked out the window at the passing landscape with the expression of someone who has important things on her mind and is thinking about all of them at once. She was traveling to Mineral Wells to see her father, who was sick, who had been asking for her, who had 3 weeks left according to the doctor's last letter. She had not told this to anyone on the coach. She was carrying it alone the way she carried most things, without complaint and without putting it down. In the corner seat, the one closest to the door and furthest from the windows, sat a man who had given his name as James Cole at the ticket counter in San Antonio. The ticket agent had written it down without looking up. The man had paid in coins. Exact amount, no conversation beyond the necessary. He was lean in the way that working men get lean, not thin but reduced to essentials, with a face that had been weathered by years of being outdoors, in weather that didn't care about faces. He wore a coat that had been good a long time ago, and a hat pulled low, and he sat with his back to the corner, and his eyes moving in the relaxed, constant way of a man for whom watching his surroundings is not a habit, but a reflex, as automatic as breathing. He had been on the coach for an hour. In that hour, he had cataloged every passenger, noted the weight distribution of the strong box by the sound it made on curves, counted the miles since the last town, and identified 3 points on the upcoming road where an ambush would be logistically convenient. He had not introduced himself to anyone. He had not spoken except once, when Ada Sinclair's bag slipped from her lap, and he caught it before it hit the floor and handed it back to her without comment. She had said, "Thank you." He had nodded once. That was all. But she had noticed his hands when he caught the bag, the speed of the catch, the steadiness, the particular way his hands moved like they had done difficult things many times and had long since stopped being surprised by difficulty. She had filed that away and looked back out the window and thought about her father. The name Jesse Callum appeared in newspaper records across 4 territories between 1869 and 1878, though never in a way that Jesse Callum would have chosen if he had been given a choice. He had not been given a choice. The West has a way of choosing men for things before the men themselves have decided anything. It had started in Abilene in 1869 when he was 22 years old and working cattle, and a man named Draper had accused him of cheating at cards in a game Jesse hadn't been playing. Draper had pulled iron. Jesse had pulled faster. Draper had survived, but only barely, and only because Jesse had aimed for the shoulder with the cold precision of a man who knew exactly where he was pointing and had decided that was where he wanted the bullet to go. A territorial judge had ruled self-defense. The crowd that had watched had spread the story, and the story had grown and spread in the way stories always do, adding details that made it larger and removing the ones that made it human, until by the time it reached the next town it barely resembled what had actually happened. After that, men came looking. Not many at first, then more. Each one wanted to test themselves against the story, wanted to be the one who changed the ending. None of them changed it. And with each one that came and went, Jesse Callum became something harder to live with and something more dangerous to be near. He had tried to leave it behind. He had tried ranching in Colorado, and that had worked for 2 years, until a bounty hunter found him. He had tried working freight in New Mexico, and that had worked for 18 months until a man from Abilene who had been there that first night showed up with a grudge and 2 friends. He had tried other things in other places, and each time the past had followed him the way his own shadow followed him, patient and permanent and impossible to outrun. He was not a cruel man. The people who had actually met him, as opposed to the people who had heard about him, said that consistently. A sheriff in Colorado had described him as the most self-contained man I have ever met, which was the closest anyone came to explaining him accurately. He was self-contained. He had learned to keep everything inside because everything he let outside had consequences he had not chosen and could not control. He was on the San Antonio to Mineral Wells stage because he had a job waiting in Mineral Wells, a simple job, guarding a mine payroll for 3 weeks, the kind of work that required particular skills and asked nothing else of him. He had planned to arrive, do the work, leave clean, simple, quiet, the way he liked things. He had been planning that for the first hour of the ride. Then the road curved into the canyon. The 5 men in the rocks above the canyon had been waiting since before sunrise. Their leader was a man named Cord Vallis, 38 years old, with a reputation in 3 counties for a particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that makes a man consistently dangerous rather than just occasionally so. His 4 men were Dix, who was large and reliable and not creative; Malone, who was creative and not reliable; 2 brothers named Causey, who were neither creative nor reliable but were willing, which Cord valued because willingness could be directed. They had robbed this line once before, 8 months ago, and taken $400 from the strong box and had not been caught. This time the strong box, according to their information, carried closer to $2,000 in mine payroll. Cord had decided $2,000 was worth another morning in the rocks. The shot that stopped the stagecoach came from Dix's rifle, aimed at the road ahead of the horses rather than at the horses themselves. Cord had a rule about horses. He had grown up on horses, and felt about killing them the way some men feel about churches. The shot landed in the dust 20 feet ahead of the lead horse, and the horse shied, and Heck Dunbar hauled back on the reins with the practice calm of a man who had been here before, and said a word under his breath that Brother Thomas would have found theologically troubling, and brought the coach to a stop in the middle of the canyon road. Inside the coach, everything happened at once. Gerald Fitch made a sound like a man being deflated and grabbed the seat with both hands. Brother Thomas said, "Lord have mercy," in a voice that suggested he meant it literally and immediately. Ada Sinclair did not make a sound. She went very still, the way people go still when their mind is working faster than their body, cataloging the situation and calculating responses with the rapid, cold efficiency of someone who has decided that panic is a luxury she cannot afford right now. And the man in the corner seat, James Cole, sat exactly as he had been sitting before the shot. He did not grab the seat. He did not say anything. His hands rested on his knees and his eyes went to window and counted 5 positions in the rocks before the coach had fully stopped. Corvallis rode down from the rocks on a gray horse, unhurried, with the easy confidence of a man who has arranged all the pieces of the situation in advance and is simply moving through the execution of a plan. His 4 men spread out around the coach. Dix and one of the Kazis on the left side, Malone and the other Kazi on the right. Cord rode to the driver's seat and told Heck to put his hands up and step down slow. And Heck did both things with a philosophical resignation of a man who had always known this particular morning was somewhere in his future. Cord told the passengers to come out one at a time with their hands visible, and they did. Gerald Fitch first, sweating and pale. Brother Thomas with his hands so high above his head it looked like he was trying to reach something on a tall shelf. Ada Sinclair, stepping down with controlled composure, looking at Corvallis with the direct eyes of someone making a clear assessment of the threat level. And last, the man from the corner seat, stepping down slow, hands loose at his sides, hat brim low. Cord looked at the passengers the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. He told them the Wells Fargo strongbox was his business, and their valuables were his business, and their lives were not his business, as long as everyone stayed sensible. He said sensible in the particular way that means he had shot people before who had chosen the alternative. Gerald Fitch immediately began removing his watch and his wallet. Brother Thomas was already holding out his small travel purse with both hands like an offering. Cord's eyes moved to Ada Sinclair and stayed there a moment longer than they needed to, and the way they stayed there told everyone present something about the kind of man Corvallis was underneath professional robbery. Then Cord's eyes moved to the quiet man beside her. He gave him the brief, flat assessment of a man who sees no threat and moves on. He had no idea. He looked right at Jesse Callum and saw a tired man in a worn coat and looked away. That was the mistake that everything else grew from. 5 armed men, 1 canyon road, 40 miles from the nearest town, and a man standing in the dust with his hands loose at his sides, who every one of those 5 men had already decided was nobody worth worrying about. If you are still riding with this story, and I believe you are, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next in that canyon is something that Corvallis had time to replay in his mind for a long time afterward. Every detail of it, wondering exactly where he had gone wrong. Stay with me. The fire is just getting started. You need to understand Corvallis to understand what happened next. He was not a stupid man. That was the important thing. Stupid outlaws did not last 8 years in 3 territories without being caught. Cord lasted because he planned carefully and executed cleanly, and because he had a rule about unnecessary violence that most men in his line of work did not share. He had never killed anyone who did not make it unavoidable. He was proud of that in the quiet, private way that men are proud of things they cannot talk about in polite company. He had planned this job for 6 weeks. He knew the schedule. He knew the strongbox contents. He knew the driver by name and reputation. He knew the canyon road better than the road itself knew itself, having walked on foot twice in the month before to memorize every rock and shadow. What he did not know, what his 6 weeks of planning had not uncovered, was the name of the quiet man in the corner seat. Not because the information was unavailable, because he had not thought to look for it. Cord had made his plan around the strongbox and the driver and the general category of passengers, and passengers his experience were merchants and ministers and women, and the occasional drunk cattle hand, none of whom required specific investigation. He had been right about that assessment many times before. He had never been this wrong before. Ada Sinclair watched Cord while his man Malone went through the coach looking for the strongbox key. She watched the way Cord moved and the way his eyes kept returning to her, and she understood what that meant and filed it under a category of problems she had been managing since she was 16 years old. She was not afraid exactly. She was calculating. Her father had been a military man before illness took his strength, and he had taught her early that the difference between fear and calculation was what you did with the information your body gave you. Fear ran or froze. Calculation used. She looked at the quiet man beside her and found him already looking at something else. The positions of the four men around the coach, his eyes moving in that steady cataloging way, and she understood something then about what he was doing. She did not say anything. She waited. It was Cord's eyes coming back to Ada a third time that started it. He rode his gray horse around the group of standing passengers slowly, the way a man circles something he is considering, and he stopped beside Ada and looked down at her from the saddle with an expression that had moved past professional robbery into something more personal and more dangerous. He said she was a long way from town to be traveling alone. Ada said she was not alone. There were 5 other passengers. Cord smiled. He said that was a matter of perspective. He looked at one of the Kazis and nodded once. The small economical nod of a man who has made decisions and is now communicating them. And the Kazi moved toward Ada. Jesse Callum said, "Do not do that." He said it quietly. No rise in the voice. No performance. Just a statement delivered in the flat, certain tone of a man identifying a fact. Everyone in the canyon went still. Not because of the volume, which was low, but because of something in the quality of the words that made the air feel different. Cord looked at him. Really looked for the first time. His eyes moved over the worn coat and the low hat and the loose hands, and then they went back to the man's face, and something he saw there made a small, cold feeling start somewhere in Cord's chest that he did not like at all. "Who are you?" Cord said. The quiet man said, "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you and your men ride out of this canyon right now and leave these people alone." Cord said he had 5 guns, and the quiet man had 2 hands. The quiet man said he was aware of the count. Cord said that was either the bravest thing he had heard this year or the most foolish. The quiet man said those 2 things were not always different. Cord studied him for another moment, and then made the decision that the rest of his life would be organized around. He told the Kazi to take the woman. He told Dix to watch the passengers. He told Malone to get the strong box. He told the second Kazi to keep a gun on the quiet man specifically. He had recognized something in that face, even if he didn't yet have a name for it, and he wanted it contained. The Kazi grabbed Ada's arm. She did not scream. She turned toward her with cold eyes and said, "You will regret this." And the certainty in her voice made the Kazi's grip loosen for just a moment before Cord said, "Hold her." Ada looked across at the quiet man. He was looking back at her. He gave a small nod. So small it was almost nothing, and she understood it to mean "I am working on this," which was either reassuring or terrifying depending on how much she trusted the source. She had known him for 2 hours. She had seen his hands catch her bag without looking. She decided to trust a nod. Jesse Callum let them take her. This was the part that Gerald Fitch would describe later with considerable outrage. The part where the quiet man did nothing while the woman was put on a horse. Brother Thomas understood it differently and said so when asked. He said the man was not doing nothing. He was counting. He was memorizing. He was letting the situation settle into its final shape before he moved. The way you let bread dough rest before you work it. Because working it too soon ruins everything. Brother Thomas had not expected to learn something about patience from a gunfighter on a canyon road, but the Lord, he said, moves in ways that are frequently surprising. Cord took Ada on his gray horse, riding behind him, and took the strong box which Malone had extracted from the coach, and rode north into the rocks with the Causey brothers flanking him. He left Dix and Malone with the passengers and the driver with instructions to hold them for 30 minutes, and then let them go. Cord rode away satisfied with the execution of his plan. He did not look back. If he had looked back, he might have seen the quiet man watching him go with eyes that were not afraid or angry, but were simply measuring the distance, noting the direction, calculating the terrain. But Cord did not look back. Men who are certain they have one rarely do. Jesse Callum waited 4 minutes after Cord rode out of sight. He counted them in his head the way he counted everything, steady and without hurry. During those 4 minutes, Dick stood with his rifle pointed at the group, and Malone walked around the perimeter of the coach, pretending to search it for additional valuables, while actually just waiting for his 30 minutes to be done. Gerald Fitch sweated and was silent. Brother Thomas prayed under his breath in a way that was quiet enough to be private, but audible enough that Jesse could hear the words. which were specific and earnest and, Jesse thought, probably appropriate to the situation. Heck Dunbar stood with his hands up and his face showing the expression of a man who has been here before and is focused on survival math. On the fourth minute, Jesse looked at Dix and said he needed to check on his horse. Dix said there were no horses. They were on a stagecoach. Jesse said he meant the lead horse, the one that had shied from the rifle shot. He said the horse might have pulled a muscle shying like that, and a pulled muscle in a lead horse on a canyon road was everyone's problem. He said it with the mild practical concern of a man who knew about horses and was not thinking about anything else at all. Dix looked at him for a moment and then said, "Fine, go look at the horse, but stay in sight." Jesse walked to the front of the coach. He checked the lead horse's left foreleg with the careful hands of someone who actually knew what he was doing. The horse was fine. Jesse knew the horse was fine before he checked. He was using the horse as geometry, putting himself at the front corner of the coach where the coach itself was between him and Malone, and Dix had to turn 30 degrees to keep him in his sight line. When Dix turned those 30 degrees, he was no longer watching Heck Dunbar. Heck, who had driven this line for 11 years and was not as slow as he sometimes appeared, noticed. Heck reached under the driver's seat where he kept a short-barreled shotgun that Wells Fargo officially did not know about. He did it slowly and without looking at it and with the practiced casual movement of a man scratching his ankle. Jesse saw Heck's hand move and gave a small nod in Heck's direction that said good. He straightened up from the horse. He turned around. He said the horse was fine, and then he drew his colt in a single smooth motion that took less time than the sentence took to say, and he put it on Dix before Dix's brain had finished processing the fact that the situation had changed. Heck came up with a shotgun from the driver's seat, and it was pointed at Malone before Malone completed his turn. Two men, two guns on them simultaneously. Nobody moving. Jesse told Dix to put the rifle down slowly. He said slowly with particular emphasis that meant he was specifying for a reason, and the reason was that fast would have a consequence. Dix put the rifle down slowly. Jesse told Malone to put his gun on the ground and step away from it. Malone looked at Heck's shotgun and made the correct calculation and did both things. Jesse picked up Dix's rifle. He tied both men to the coach wheel with their own belts and the leather straps on the luggage rack, which Heck helped with efficiently and without being asked. Gerald Fitch watched all of this with his mouth slightly open. Brother Thomas had stopped praying and was watching with the focused attention of a man updating his understanding of the world in real time. Jesse took Dix's horse, which was tied behind the coach, and Heck's saddle horse, which was kept for emergencies behind the driver's seat. He looked at Heck and said the nearest town was back 20 miles. He told Heck to take the passengers back and send a deputy out to collect Dix and Malone. Heck said, "What about you?" and Jesse said he would be managing his own business. Heck looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has just watched something he is going to be telling people about for the rest of his life. He said, "You got a name, friend?" Jesse said, "James Cole." Heck said, "Sure you do." Jesse got on Dix's horse. He looked at the direction Cord had ridden. He started north into the rocks. The canyon opened into hill country to the north, red rock and scrub cedar and the occasional dark mouth of shallow cave, the kind of terrain that was good for hiding in and difficult for following through. Jesse had been in worse. He read the tracks the way he had learned to read them over years of being both the follower and the followed. Each hoofprint a sentence in a language that took time to learn and paid dividends once you had. 3 horses going north and slightly east, moving at a pace that said confident rather than fleeing, which meant Cord had a destination in mind rather than simply putting distance between himself and the canyon road. He rode for an hour through the hills, staying below the ridge lines, moving in the shade where the ground was softer and the tracks were clearer, and he himself was harder to spot from above. He had not eaten since morning. He noticed this the way he noticed most physical things, as information rather than complaint. The sun was moving west, and the shadows were lengthening, and the hill country was beginning to cool in a specific way that desert country cools at the end of a hot day. The heat lifting off the rock, and the air coming down from the higher elevations, carrying the smell of cedar and dry grass. He found their camp at the base of a red rock formation that rose 50 feet straight up from the flat ground around it, a natural shelter with one approach and good visibility in 3 directions. Cord had chosen it well. Jesse acknowledged this without sentiment. He left the horses tied in a cedar thicket a quarter-mile back and went the rest of the way on foot, moving through the scrub with the slow, particular patience of a man who understood that hurry was the enemy of everything he needed to accomplish in the next hour. Ada Sinclair was sitting against the base of the rock formation with her wrists tied in front of her and her ankles crossed and her back straight, and her expression showing cold, controlled fury rather than fear. The fury was directed at Cord, who was sitting by a small fire 20 feet away looking at the strong box with the satisfaction of a man who has done a day's work he is pleased with. The Causey brothers were on opposite sides of the camp, one sitting, one standing, neither paying attention with the focus the situation required. That was the carelessness of men who believed the difficult part was done. Ada saw Jesse before anyone else did. He came out of the shadow of a boulder at the edge of the camp, and she saw him, and her eyes went to him, and she very deliberately did not react, did not look relieved, did not look surprised, looked for one careful second, and then looked back at the fire. That second was enough for Jesse to understand she had seen him, and was managing her own response, which was exactly right, which told him something important about her. He watched the camp for 12 minutes from the shadow of the boulder. He counted breathing patterns. He noted where hands rested relative to guns. He mapped the fire's light, and where it reached and where it didn't. He was not afraid, but he was careful, which is different and more useful. Then he moved. Jesse came into the camp from the east, where the fire's light was weakest and the standing Causey was looking west. He came in low and fast and quiet, the way he had learned to move in situations where announcing himself will remove his advantages before he could use them. He reached the seated Causey first. One clean strike to the back of the head. Precise. The force calibrated to put a man down without killing him. A calculation that required both knowledge and restraint in equal measure. The Causey went down without a sound. The sound of his body settling in the dirt was enough. The standing Causey turned. Jesse already had his coat out. He said, "Put it down quietly," and the Causey looked at the gun and at the man holding it and at his brother on the ground and made the reasonable assessment that his options had narrowed considerably. He put his gun down quietly. Jesse told him to sit down beside his brother, and he did. Then Cord Vallis was on his feet, and his gun was in his hand, and the firelight was between them, and Jesse said, "Do not do it." He said it in the same flat, certain tone he had used in the canyon, the tone that was not a threat, because it was past threats. That was simply a description of what was going to happen. Cord had his gun up, and he was looking across the fire at Jesse Callum, and something was clicking into place behind his eyes. Something about the way this man moved and held himself and spoke. Some piece of information trying to find its match in his memory. "Who are you?" Cord said. Jesse told him. He said his name the way a man states a fact that has been asked for, without performance, without weight, just information being provided. And Cord Vallis heard the name Jesse Callum, and the color changed in his face in the firelight, and his gun hand did not lower, but it changed, a slight change in the angle of the wrist, the unconscious physical acknowledgement of a mind that has just received news it did not want. He had heard that name. He knew what it meant. He had heard it in 3 territories in connection with 6 men who had drawn on Jesse Callum and lost, each of them faster than Cord was. He knew that because his own assessment of his speed was honest. Cord was good. He was not that good. The moment stretched. The fire cracked once. An owl called somewhere in the rocks above them. Ada Sinclair watched from the base of the rock formation with her wrists still tied and her eyes moving between the 2 men. She was calculating as always. She had decided several minutes ago that if it came to violence, she would throw herself sideways away from the line between them, which was the only useful thing she could do with tied wrists and crossed ankles, and she was prepared to do it the moment the situation required it. It did not require it. Cord lowered his gun. He did it slow, and he did it deliberate, making it clear it was a decision rather than a surrender, though the difference between those 2 things was thinner in this moment than Cord would have liked. He set the gun on the ground. He straightened up. He said he supposed this was over then. Jesse said yes. He said he would be taking the woman and the strong box and the horses, and Cord and his man would wait here until a deputy arrived from the canyon road, which would be approximately 3 hours. Cord said 3 hours in the rocks was a long wait. Jesse said Cord could consider it time to reflect on the career choices that had led to this particular evening. Cord made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction, and sat down by the fire with the resigned air of a man who has recognized checkmate and is waiting for the board to be cleared. Jesse cut Ada's wrist free with a small knife from his belt. She rubbed her wrists and stood up, which she did without assistance because she did not reach for his hand and he did not offer it. Both of them apparently understanding without discussion that she did not need it. She looked at Cord by the fire and at the Kazi's on the ground and at the strong box sitting where Malone had put it, and then she looked at Jesse and said, "You came after us alone." He said yes. She said that was either very brave or very foolish. He said he had heard that assessment earlier today and had not found it more convincing the second time. She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction, and she said, "We should go." He said yes. They rode back to the hill country in the long blue dusk of a Texas summer evening, the sky going from gold to purple to the deep dark blue that comes just before full dark. Jesse rode Dix's horse, and Ada rode the Causey's horse, and the strong box was tied across the third horse behind them. They did not talk for the first mile. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was a silence of two people who have been through something together and are letting it settle before they decide what to make of it. Ada spoke first. She asked him how long he had known something was wrong on the road. He said since before the canyon. He said he had identified 3 probable ambush points on the route before they reached the first one, and the canyon was the most likely. She asked if he had said anything to anyone. He said no. She asked why not. He said because telling 6 frightened people that an ambush was likely in the next hour was not going to improve their ability to survive one. She was quiet for a moment and then said that was coldly logical. He said most useful things were. She thought about that and did not argue with it. She told him about her father then. Not everything, just enough. The illness, the letter, the 3 weeks the doctor had given him. She said in the matter-of-fact tone she used for most things, the tone that carried the weight without displaying it. Jesse listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interruption, without the performed sympathy that people offer when they do not know what else to do. When she finished, he said he was sorry. Just that. She said thank you. Just that. And somehow the brevity of it was exactly right. He asked about the bag she had been carrying on the stagecoach, the one he had caught. She said it had her father's letters in it. 3 years of them. She said she read them when things were difficult, and she had read one that morning in San Antonio before getting on the coach, and she had been thinking about it when the ambush happened. He asked what the letter said. She was quiet for a moment, and then said her father had written that the measure of a person was not what they did when everything was going right, but what they chose when everything was going wrong. She said he had been writing her those kinds of letters since she was 12 years old, and she had not always understood them at the time, but she understood them better now. Jesse thought about that for a while. Then he said her father sounded like a man worth getting to. She said yes, she thought so too, and her voice was very steady when she said it. They reached the main road as full dark came down and rode east toward mineral wells under a sky full of stars. The horses moved at an easy walk. The night air was cooler than the day and smelled of cedar and dust and the particular clean emptiness of open Texas country after dark. Jesse was aware of her beside him the way that a man is aware of something that has changed without his expecting it to change, a new fact in the landscape of life that had been planned around the absence of new facts. They reached Mineral Wells at 2 a.m. The town was dark and quiet with the absolute quiet of a frontier town between midnight and dawn, every light out, every sound the sound of wind, an occasional distant dog. The deputy's office had a lamp burning. A deputy inside who was 22 years old and very surprised to receive 2 riders, a strong box, and a report of 5 outlaws tied up in hill country all at once in the middle of the night. He wrote everything down carefully and asked Jesse his name. Jesse said James Cole. The deputy wrote that down. He looked at the name and then looked at Jesse and then wrote something else beside it with a question mark and closed his book. Ada went to hotel and Jesse went to boarding house, and in the morning they met at the hotel dining room for breakfast because she had sent a note asking him to, a short note, 3 lines very direct, which he read twice before going. They ate breakfast and she asked what came next for him, and he said guarding a mine payroll for 3 weeks. She asked, and after that, he said east probably. She said he was always going east or west or somewhere. He said some people were built that way. She said she thought That was something people told themselves when the real answer was more complicated. He looked at her. She looked back. She said she was not prying. She was observing, and she found the distinction important. He said it was a fair distinction. He said she was probably right that the real answer was more complicated. He walked her to the livery stable where she hired a horse to ride the 12 miles out to her father's place. Before she got on the horse, she turned and looked at him with the direct eyes that had been reading him since the moment he caught her bag on the stagecoach. She said she did not know if they would meet again. He said no, he didn't know either. She said she hoped they would. He said he did too. She said that was the most he had volunteered about his own feelings in the entire time she had known him. He said she brought out an unusual quality of honesty in people. She almost smiled. She got on the horse. She rode east down the Mineral Wells Road into the morning with her bag of letters on her shoulder and her back straight and her chin up, and Jesse Callum stood at the livery stable door and watched her go and thought about a great many things he had no words for yet. He went to work 3 days later guarding the mine payroll. He did his job carefully and well, and when the 3 weeks were done, he was paid, and he stood in the street in Mineral Wells for a long moment looking east, and then west, and then east again. He got on his horse. He rode east. He did not examine why he chose east specifically. Some things you do not examine too closely. You just point yourself at them and ride. I think about the moment in the canyon when Corvallis looked at Jesse Callum and saw nothing worth worrying about. A tired man in a worn coat. Nobody important. Not a threat. I think about how completely and catastrophically wrong that assessment was, and I think about why it happened. Core was a careful man. Core was an intelligent man. He had survived 8 years as an outlaw through the quality of his planning and the accuracy of his reading of situations. And he missed it entirely. He looked right at one of the most dangerous men in 4 territories and saw an unremarkable passenger and moved on. He missed it because Jesse Callum did not look like what the word dangerous is supposed to look like. He was not large. He was not loud. He did not announce himself. He did not need anyone to know what he was. He simply was it, quietly and completely, without performance or decoration, and that absence of performance was exactly what made Cord miss it. We have ideas about what things look like, what dangerous looks like, what important looks like, what worth paying attention to looks like, and those ideas cause us to overlook the things that do not match the picture we already have in our minds. Ada Sinclair did not miss it. She saw his hands catch her bag. She noticed the speed and the steadiness. She saw his eyes moving in the coach. She did not know his name or his history, but she read the evidence in front of her and updated her understanding. And when he gave her that small nod in the canyon, she trusted it. Not because she knew him, because she had been paying attention. There is something in that worth sitting with. The difference between looking and seeing. The difference between having eyes and using them. Jesse Callum was not a perfect man, and he would have told you so without hesitation. He carried things that did not show on ordinary days. He had made choices he could not unmake, and lived with consequences he had not chosen. But he had made one decision somewhere on the long road of his life, and that decision was that when he saw something wrong, he was not going to calculate whether it was his business. He was going to move, not recklessly, not without thinking, with exactly the care and patience and precision that the situation required. But he was going to move. And sometimes the only thing that stands between a person and the worst day of their life is one quiet man in a worn coat who decided a long time ago that looking away was not something he was willing to do anymore. I wonder what you are looking at in your own life right now that you have been telling yourself is not your business. I wonder what the person beside you is carrying that you have noticed but not asked about. I wonder if there's a nod you could give someone today, small enough that nobody else would see it. That would mean I am working on this, and you are not alone. Those small nods change things. Quietly, permanently, in ways you do not always get to see the full result of, but they change things. If this story stayed with you, even just a piece of it, even just one moment that landed somewhere and stayed there, then I have one simple ask. Hit subscribe. It tells me you are here. It tells me to keep writing and keep finding stories worth telling and fires worth sitting beside. And before you go, pour yourself something warm and settle in for a moment and tell me this. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you listening from? I read every single one of those. Every last comment, every location, every time. I mean that completely. Next time, a man walks into a town where everyone knows his name and nobody is glad to see him. And the one person who is glad is the one person who should not be. Stay close to the fire. I will see you next time. This is a story created for entertainment purposes. It is inspired by Western storytelling traditions and does not represent real historical events or real people. The images used are AI illustrations made to carry the spirit and feeling of the world we are building together in these stories. The title is The Door. What is inside is what matters. If it meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me. That is how I know which fires to keep burning.